Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. Lucien Beaumont dropped his coffee cup in shock as he watched 50 enormous women march across his Colorado ranch like an army of Amazons claiming territory they intended to conquer. Each stood at least 6 feet tall, their powerful frames draped in traveling clothes that couldn't hide muscles earned through lives of hard labor and fierce independence. They moved with military precision, led by a woman whose presence commanded attention even among such an intimidating group. Nearly 7 feet tall, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire that could reduce lesser men to ash. The lead woman approached his porch with movements that suggested barely contained violence, her massive frame casting shadows that made Lucien feel like a child facing judgment from an angry giant. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience from everyone around her. "You are Lucien Beaumont," she declared rather than asked. "I am Brigitte Valmont, and these are my sisters. We have come in response to your advertisement for wives. Prepare yourself, little man. We are here to evaluate whether you are worthy of joining our family." Lucien's mind reeled as he tried to process what was happening to his previously quiet ranch. He'd never placed any advertisement for wives, had sworn off marriage entirely after his fiancée had left him for a wealthier man 3 years ago. But somehow, 50 giant women had descended on his property like a natural disaster, each one studying him with eyes that seemed to weigh his soul and find it possibly wanting. They carried themselves like warriors rather than potential brides, and their very presence transformed his peaceful homestead into something resembling a military encampment. "There's been a mistake," Lucien managed to stammer, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's despite his 32 years of frontier experience. "I never advertised for wives. I don't want to get married. I think you ladies have the wrong ranch." His protests sounded weak even to his own ears. And the amused laughter that rippled through the group of women made it clear they found his denial both pathetic and entertaining. Brigitte stepped closer, close enough that Lucien could smell the leather and steel that seemed to be her natural perfume, close enough that he had to crane his neck to meet her burning gaze. "The advertisement was placed by someone who cares about your future, little cowboy. But whether you intended it or not, we are here now, and we do not travel 50 miles through dangerous territory for nothing. You will be evaluated, you will be tested, and if you prove worthy, you will choose one of us to be your wife. The alternative—" She let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, making it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. As the 50 giant women began setting up what looked suspiciously like a permanent camp on his land, Lucien realized his bachelor days were over whether he wanted them to be or not. 3 years earlier, Lucien had stood at the altar of the Redemption Falls Church and watched his bride-to-be, Isabella Morrison, walk down the aisle toward another man, the wealthy banker's son who could offer her luxuries that a simple rancher could never provide. The humiliation had been complete and public, witnessed by every person in town who'd come to see what they'd thought would be his wedding. Instead, they'd watched him become a cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching above your station and the fickleness of women who valued gold over genuine affection. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound Lucien had ever received, teaching him that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, and marriage was a trap that would only lead to more pain. Isabella's parting words still echoed in his memory. "You're a good man, Lucien, but good men finish last in this world. I need security, not romantic dreams about building something together through hard work and dedication." Her practical cruelty had been worse than simple rejection because it had made his feelings seem naive and worthless. In the aftermath of his public humiliation, Lucian had withdrawn from all social contact, focusing entirely on building his ranch into something that could sustain him through a life he'd decided would be lived alone. He'd thrown himself into the work with desperate intensity, clearing land, building fences, acquiring cattle, and creating prosperity that proved he could succeed without anyone's help. The ranch had become his fortress against a world that had taught him that trusting others was the fastest way to ensure disappointment and pain. The townspeople had tried to help at first, with well-meaning neighbors suggesting eligible women and local widows, making it clear they'd welcome his attention. But Lucian had rebuffed every overture, earning a reputation for coldness that eventually discouraged further attempts at matchmaking. He'd become known as the confirmed bachelor who wanted nothing to do with marriage, love, or any relationship that might complicate his carefully controlled existence. His isolation had been comfortable, predictable, and completely under his control, exactly what he'd thought he wanted after learning that emotional vulnerability was just another word for stupidity. The ranch prospered, his bank account grew, and his life followed routines that never surprised or disappointed him. He'd convinced himself that contentment was better than happiness, that security was more valuable than companionship, and that a man who'd been betrayed once was a fool if he allowed it to happen again. But now, facing 50 giant women who'd somehow invaded his sanctuary, Lucian was beginning to understand that the universe had a sense of humor about men who thought they could control their destinies by avoiding all risk of human connection. The truth about the advertisement emerged when Father Auguste Moreau arrived at the ranch the next morning, his weathered face bearing the satisfied expression of a man whose schemes had worked exactly as planned. The elderly priest had been Lucien's confessor since childhood, the only person who'd maintained contact despite his self-imposed isolation, and apparently the only one with enough nerve to interfere in his carefully ordered bachelor existence. His smile was equal parts apologetic and unrepentant as he faced the chaos his meddling had created. "I placed the advertisement," Father Moreau admitted, without the slightest show of remorse. "You've been hiding from life for 3 years, my son, and hiding is not the same as living. These women come from a community in the Dakota Territory where good men are scarce and strong women are abundant. They seek husbands who can appreciate their unique qualities, while you need someone who won't be intimidated by your stubborn independence." His explanation made it clear he'd planned this invasion with careful attention to what he considered Lucian's spiritual needs. The priest's revelation that he'd been secretly corresponding with a network of religious communities throughout the frontier territories was shocking enough, but his description of the women he'd summoned was even more surprising. "The Valmont sisters are not ordinary females seeking conventional marriages," he explained with obvious admiration. "They are warriors, leaders, and builders who've created their own society in the wilderness. Their community has prospered because they value strength over beauty, competence over compliance, and partnership over domination. I thought you might appreciate such qualities if you could overcome your fear of strong women." Lucian's protests that he wasn't afraid of anyone, especially women, fell on deaf ears as Father Moreau continued his explanation with the persistence of someone who'd been planning this intervention for months. Isabella Morrison was weak, dependent, and ultimately worthless as a partner for a man building something meaningful in this harsh land. These women are different. They've survived conditions that would kill ordinary people, built communities that thrive without male protection, and developed skills that most men would envy. If you're going to be forced into marriage, better it should be with someone who can handle whatever challenges life brings. The priest's final revelation was the most disturbing of all. The women weren't just visiting to evaluate him. They were prepared to stay until one of them had successfully claimed him as a husband. "Their community has invested substantial resources in this expedition," Father Moreau explained cheerfully. "They won't return empty-handed, and they won't accept rejection from a man they've traveled so far to meet. Your choice is not whether to marry one of them, but which one you'll choose before they choose for you. As the implications of his situation became clear, Lucian realized he was trapped between 50 determined women and a meddling priest who seemed to think forced marriage was a reasonable solution to unwanted bachelorhood. The evaluation process began at dawn with tests that challenged every assumption Lucian had about what women wanted from potential husbands. Instead of cooking demonstrations or domestic competitions, the 50 giant women put him through physical trials that would have challenged professional soldiers. They wanted to see if he could handle an axe, ride a wild horse, and defend property against armed attackers. Their standards were unlike anything he'd encountered in the conventional world of frontier courtship. Brigitte Valmont supervised the testing with the attention to detail of a military commander evaluating potential recruits for dangerous missions. She watched him split wood, handle livestock, and demonstrate shooting accuracy with eyes that missed nothing and revealed little about whether his performance met their mysterious standards. When he struggled with tasks that required brute strength rather than skill, she neither mocked nor encouraged, simply made notes in a leather-bound journal that apparently contained evaluations of his worthiness as husband material. The most intimidating test involved armed combat against women who fought with weapons and techniques he'd never seen before. They used combinations of knives, staves, and bare-handed fighting that spoke of training far beyond what frontier self-defense required. When Lucian found himself flat on his back, with a knife at his throat after less than 30 seconds of combat, the lesson was clear. These women didn't need husbands for protection. They needed partners who could keep up with their dangerous lifestyle. But it wasn't physical prowess that seemed to matter most to his evaluators. It was character under pressure, resourcefulness when facing impossible odds, and the kind of moral courage that couldn't be faked or learned quickly. They created scenarios where he had to choose between personal safety and protecting others, between profit and principle, between easy solutions and right actions. Each test revealed more about their values and priorities than his, painting a picture of a community that had survived by putting honor above convenience. The most disturbing part of the evaluation was the growing realization that he was beginning to respect these extraordinary women even as they terrified him. Their strength wasn't just physical, it was intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. They'd built something remarkable in the wilderness, creating a society that functioned without the traditional power structures that dominated frontier communities. And somehow, Father Moreau had convinced them that Lucien Beaumont was worth their time and attention. As the first day of testing ended with him exhausted, humbled, and strangely exhilarated, Lucien began to understand that his carefully controlled bachelor existence was about to be transformed in ways he couldn't predict or prevent. Among all the intimidating women who'd invaded his ranch, it was Brigitte Valmont who commanded Lucien's unwilling fascination and absolute terror in equal measure. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her silver-streaked hair braided with feathers and small bones that suggested victories in conflicts he couldn't imagine. Her arms bore scars that told stories of battles survived and enemies overcome, while her eyes held depths of experience that made him feel like a child playing at being a man. When she looked at him, Lucian felt measured against standards he didn't understand and probably couldn't meet. Brigitte's leadership of the group was absolute, but not tyrannical. She commanded through competence and respect rather than fear and intimidation. The other women deferred to her judgment while maintaining their own independence, creating a dynamic that fascinated Lucian with its combination of hierarchy and equality. She made decisions quickly and enforced them fairly, but she also listened to dissenting opinions and changed course when presented with better alternatives. Her authority was earned rather than inherited, which made it more impressive than any title or position could have been. The conversations Lucien overheard between Brigitte and her followers revealed depths of intelligence and sophistication that challenged everything he thought he knew about frontier women. They discussed strategy, philosophy, and complex social issues with the analytical precision of educated leaders planning the future of their community. Their concerns went far beyond individual marriages to encompass questions about cultural survival, economic development, and the preservation of their unique way of life in a world that was increasingly hostile to unconventional societies. But it was Brigitte's personal attention that both thrilled and terrified Lucien more than anything else about his situation. She studied him with the intensity of a predator, evaluating potential prey, but also with something that might have been genuine interest in his character and capabilities. Her questions probed beyond surface accomplishments to examine his values, motivations, and the kind of man he might become under proper guidance. She treated him as if he had potential worth developing, which was more flattering and frightening than simple attraction could ever have been. When Brigitte announced that the preliminary evaluations were complete and the serious testing would begin the next day, Lucien felt his stomach clench with anxiety about what she considered serious if the previous trials had been preliminary. "Tomorrow, we discover whether you are a man worth claiming," she told him with a smile that revealed teeth filed to points in the traditional manner of her people. "The tests will be harder, the standards higher, and the consequences of failure more permanent. Sleep well tonight, little cowboy. It may be the last peaceful rest you enjoy for quite some time." As he watched her walk away with movements that suggested barely contained violence, Lucien realized he was falling for the one woman who could destroy him completely if she chose to reject his suit, assuming he survived whatever trials she had planned for tomorrow. The second phase of testing revealed that Lucien wasn't just being evaluated by the 50 women, he was competing against them for the right to be considered worthy of marriage into their community. Brigitte announced that he would face challenges designed to test every aspect of his character, skills, and determination against standards that had been developed through generations of selecting partners capable of surviving in their harsh mountain territory. The competition wasn't just about impressing potential wives. It was about proving he deserved to join a society that had thrived by accepting only the strongest and most capable individuals. The physical challenges escalated beyond anything Lucien had experienced during his years of frontier life. He found himself racing against women who could outrun horses, climbing rock faces that would challenge mountain goats, and surviving in wilderness conditions with minimal supplies while being hunted by trackers whose skills exceeded those of professional scouts. Each trial pushed him beyond his known limits, forcing him to discover reserves of strength and endurance he'd never suspected he possessed. But the mental and emotional tests were even more demanding than the physical ones. Brigitte created scenarios where he had to make impossible choices under extreme pressure, deciding which of several injured people to save when he could only help one, choosing between personal survival and protecting strangers, determining how to distribute limited resources among desperate people. His responses were evaluated not just for their practical effectiveness, but for the values they revealed about his character and moral priorities. The most challenging aspect of the competition was the growing realization that he was beginning to care about earning their approval rather than simply surviving their tests. These extraordinary women had created something remarkable in the wilderness, and being accepted into their community was starting to seem like an honor worth pursuing rather than a fate to be endured. Their strength, intelligence, and fierce independence were qualities he'd never experienced in the conventional women he'd known, and their society offered partnership rather than the traditional male dominance he'd always assumed was natural. As the days passed and the tests grew more demanding, Lucien found himself pushing harder, not because he feared failure, but because he genuinely wanted to prove himself worthy of people he was learning to respect and admire. The transformation from reluctant victim to eager participant happened gradually, but by the end of the first week, he was approaching each new challenge with determination rather than dread. The women had achieved something he wouldn't have thought possible. They'd made him want to become a better man than he'd ever imagined he could be, and the possibility of earning Brigitte's approval was becoming more important to him than maintaining the safe, predictable bachelor existence he'd spent 3 years building. The truth about Brigitte's past emerged during a quiet evening when exhaustion from the day's trials had left both of them sitting by the fire in companionable silence. She began speaking without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of memories that had shaped her into the formidable leader she'd become. "I was married once," she said quietly, staring into flames that reflected the pain in her eyes. "My husband was a good man who died defending our village from raiders. I led the survivors into the mountains and built something new from the ashes of what we'd lost." Her story revealed depths of tragedy and triumph that explained both her strength and her wariness about forming new attachments. The community she'd created wasn't just a settlement. It was a refuge for women who'd been cast out, widowed, or abandoned by a society that had no place for females who refused to be dependent on male protection. They'd survived by developing skills that made them self-sufficient, creating bonds that transcended traditional family structures, and establishing standards that ensured only the strongest individuals could join their ranks. "We've prospered in isolation," Brigitte continued, "but isolation brings its own dangers. We need new blood, fresh perspectives, and partners who can help us grow without destroying what makes us unique. Most men want to control what they don't understand, to change what they can't dominate. We've learned to be very careful about who we allow into our world." Her explanation made it clear that Lucian's evaluation was about more than personal compatibility. It was about the survival of an entire community. The revelation that Father Moreau had been corresponding with their leaders for over a year added new dimensions to what Lucien had thought was simple meddling. The priest had apparently convinced them that he possessed qualities they needed: integrity, adaptability, and the kind of strength that came from overcoming adversity rather than avoiding it. "He told us about your betrayal, your withdrawal, and your recovery," Brigitte admitted. "He said you'd learned that real strength comes from surviving pain, not from avoiding it." As she spoke about her hopes and fears for her people's future, Lucien began to understand that accepting him into their community would be as much a risk for them as it would be for him. They weren't just offering marriage. They were offering membership in something precious and fragile that could be destroyed by the wrong person in the wrong position. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and terrifying, making him realize that winning Brigitte's heart would only be the beginning of earning his place in a world where failure could mean the destruction of everything she'd worked to build. The moment Lucien realized he was falling in love with Brigitte came during a test that nearly killed him, a survival challenge in the mountains where he had to navigate treacherous terrain while being pursued by skilled hunters determined to capture him before he reached safety. When he stumbled and fell into a ravine, injuring his leg badly enough that continuing seemed impossible, it was Brigitte who appeared like an avenging angel to help him complete the trial despite his injury. Her touch was gentle, despite her fearsome reputation, and her encouragement gave him strength to finish what he'd started. "Why?" he gasped as she helped him climb the final ridge that marked the end of the challenge. "Why help me when this is supposed to test whether I can survive on my own?" Her answer revealed depths of character that went beyond the warrior facade she presented to the world. "Because true strength isn't about suffering alone," she said quietly. "It's about knowing when to accept help and when to offer it. A partner who's too proud to be vulnerable when necessary is a partner who'll get everyone killed when real danger comes." The conversation that followed as they made their way back to camp became the most honest exchange Lucien had ever shared with anyone. Brigitte spoke about the loneliness of leadership, the burden of being responsible for so many lives, and the fear that accepting love might make her vulnerable in ways that could endanger her people. Lucien found himself confessing his own fears, that he wasn't strong enough to be worth her attention, that his previous betrayal had damaged him beyond repair, and that joining her community might cost him the independence he'd fought so hard to achieve. "Love isn't supposed to be safe," Brigitte said as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. "If it were safe, it wouldn't be worth anything. What matters is whether the risk brings rewards that justify the danger." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd lost everything once and rebuilt it into something stronger, and they made Lucian understand that his fear of being hurt again was actually fear of living fully. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, sharing water and trail food while watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Lucien felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the small fire they'd built, and everything to do with the woman whose strength made his own weakness seem like something that could be overcome rather than endured. For the first time since Isabella's betrayal, he found himself hoping for a future that included another person, and the hope was both precious and fragile enough that he was afraid to examine it too closely. But when Brigitte's hand briefly touched his as she reached for her pack, the contact sent electricity through him that made denial impossible. He was falling for the one woman who could either complete him or destroy him utterly. The arrival of Marcus Delacroix shattered the fragile peace that had been developing between Lucien and the community of warrior women like a boulder through glass. Marcus was everything Lucien wasn't: tall, wealthy, confident, and completely unintimidated by 50 giant women who could probably kill him without breaking stride. He rode into camp with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, his expensive clothes and silver-mounted saddle announcing his prosperity to anyone within miles. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to know Brigitte personally, and his arrival made her stiffen with emotions Lucien couldn't identify. "Brigitte, my magnificent warrior queen," Marcus called out with the familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to such informality through past intimacy. "I heard through certain channels that you were seeking a husband for yourself and partners for your sisters. Naturally, I came immediately to offer my services. Why settle for some provincial rancher when you could have a man with the resources and connections to give you everything you deserve?" His proposal was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been rejected by anyone he'd considered worth pursuing. The tension that filled the camp as Marcus made his intentions clear was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other women watched their leader's reaction with obvious concern, while Lucien felt his stomach drop as he realized he was facing competition from someone who possessed every advantage he lacked. Marcus had money, social connections, and the kind of worldly sophistication that made frontier ranchers seem provincial by comparison. Worse yet, his obvious familiarity with Brigitte suggested a history that predated Lucien's arrival by years or even decades. Brigitte's response to Marcus's presumptuous proposal revealed depths of anger that Lucien had never seen before, her usual controlled demeanor cracking to show the fury beneath. "You have considerable nerve showing your face here, Marcus," she said with deadly quietness that made several women reach for their weapons. "Especially after what happened in Denver. Did you think I'd forgotten? Did you imagine that time had healed wounds you inflicted deliberately?" Her words carried personal pain that made it clear Marcus's arrival wasn't just unwelcome, it was actively dangerous. Marcus's smile never wavered, despite the obvious hostility of his reception, and his next words revealed why he was confident enough to face 50 armed women who clearly wanted him gone. "I know you're still angry about our little misunderstanding," he said with condescending patience, "but surely you realize that our past complications make us perfectly suited for each other. We both know what we're capable of when properly motivated. This provincial rancher might seem charming now, but he'll never be able to handle the real you. He'll never be strong enough to match your fire." As Marcus spoke about Lucien as if he were a naive child playing at games beyond his comprehension, the challenge became clear. This wasn't just about winning Brigitte's hand. It was about proving which man was worthy of a woman whose strength could destroy anyone who wasn't her equal. The story of Brigitte and Marcus's shared past emerged that evening like poison from an infected wound, each detail more disturbing than the last. They'd been lovers 5 years earlier, when Brigitte had been young enough to mistake dangerous charisma for genuine strength and wealthy enough to believe that money could solve any problem. Marcus had courted her with the single-minded intensity of a man who viewed exceptional women as trophies to be collected rather than partners to be cherished, and she'd been naive enough to think his obsession was actually love. "He promised me partnership," Brigitte told Lucien as they sat apart from the others, her voice carrying shame that had nothing to do with what had happened and everything to do with how long it had taken her to recognize the truth. "He said he wanted a woman who could match his ambition, someone who could stand beside him as he built an empire that would span the entire Western territory. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because I thought I'd finally found a man who wouldn't be intimidated by my strength." Her confession revealed vulnerabilities that made her seem more human and more precious than her warrior facade had suggested. The partnership Marcus had promised had quickly revealed itself to be slavery disguised as romance. With every decision subject to his approval and every aspect of her life controlled by his desire to possess rather than cherish what he'd claimed to love. When Brigitte had finally rebelled against his suffocating control, Marcus had responded with violence that left scars on her soul even deeper than the physical marks on her body. "He said I belonged to him," she whispered, touching a scar on her throat that Lucien had noticed but never dared to ask about. "He said he'd rather see me dead than free to leave him." The escape from Marcus's control had cost Brigitte everything she'd owned and everyone she'd trusted, forcing her to flee into the wilderness with nothing but her weapons and her determination to never again allow anyone to own her. The community she'd built in the mountains was as much fortress as settlement, designed to protect women who'd learned that conventional society offered them only the choice between submission and destruction. Marcus's arrival threatened not just her personal peace, but the safety of everyone who'd found refuge under her protection. "He won't give up," Brigitte said with the certainty of someone who'd spent years understanding the mind of a predator. "Marcus doesn't lose gracefully, and he's never accepted that any woman could reject him permanently. He'll stay here until he either claims me or destroys everything I've built trying. The only way to end this is to defeat him so completely that he never dares to threaten us again." Her words carried implications that made Lucien's blood run cold, because defeating Marcus would require more than winning a simple competition. It would require becoming the kind of man who could destroy someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of taking whatever he wanted through violence and intimidation. As he looked into Brigitte's eyes and saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide, Lucien realized that earning her love would mean nothing if he couldn't protect her from the monster she'd once been foolish enough to trust. Marcus's challenge was issued at dawn with all the formal ceremony of a medieval duel, complete with witnesses and specific terms that would determine not just who won Brigitte's hand, but who controlled the fate of the entire community. "Since we both want the same prize," Marcus announced with theatrical flourish, "let's settle this like men of honor. 3 contests, physical combat, strategic thinking, and a test of character to be designed by the lady herself. Winner takes all. Loser leaves permanently and never returns." His proposal seemed reasonable until the details were revealed, each contest designed to favor his particular strengths while exposing Lucien's limitations. The first test was hand-to-hand combat without weapons, and Marcus's advantages were immediately obvious. He was taller, heavier, and trained in fighting techniques that went far beyond frontier brawling to include methods learned from military academies and professional instruction. When they faced each other in the circle marked out by the 50 women, Lucian felt like David facing Goliath. Except this Goliath had formal training and a killer's instincts that would make victory through luck or inspiration almost impossible. The fight was brutal, methodical, and completely one-sided until desperation forced Lucian to abandon conventional techniques in favor of the dirty fighting he'd learned during his hardest years on the frontier. Marcus's superior training meant nothing when faced with someone willing to use elbows, knees, and teeth as weapons, and his expensive education hadn't included lessons on how to handle an opponent who fought like his life depended on winning. When Lucien finally managed to pin Marcus through sheer determination and refusal to surrender, the victory felt hollow because it had been won through desperation rather than skill. The second test involved strategic planning for defending the mountain community against a hypothetical attack by superior forces, and here Marcus's advantages in education and military training were overwhelming. His plan was sophisticated, thorough, and clearly the product of someone who'd studied warfare at the highest levels. Lucien's response was simpler, more direct, and based on intimate knowledge of the local terrain rather than abstract tactical principles. When Brigitte declared his plan the winner because it better understood the realities of their specific situation, Marcus's confidence cracked for the first time since his arrival. The final test was Brigitte's choice, and her selection revealed how well she'd come to understand both men during their competition. "You will each spend 3 days alone in the wilderness with only basic survival gear," she announced. "But you won't be competing against each other. You'll be helping to search for a lost child who wandered away from a neighboring settlement. How you handle this responsibility will show me everything I need to know about your character." As they prepared for a test that would reveal who they really were when no one was watching, both men understood that this final challenge would determine not just who won Brigitte's heart, but who deserved it. The lost child was 8-year-old Marie Bouchard, who'd wandered away from her family's homestead 3 days earlier while chasing a butterfly that had led her deep into the treacherous mountain wilderness. The terrain was a maze of ravines, dense forest, and rocky outcroppings that could hide a small person from even experienced searchers, while dangerous wildlife and unpredictable weather made every hour of delay potentially fatal. Both Lucian and Marcus understood that finding Marie alive would require more than luck. It would demand every skill they possessed, and some they'd have to discover. Marcus approached the search with military precision, dividing the territory into grid squares and systematically checking each area with methods that looked impressive, but failed to account for how a frightened child might actually behave when lost and alone. His expensive equipment and formal training were less useful than practical experience when dealing with someone whose actions were guided by fear rather than logic. After 2 days of methodical searching, he'd covered substantial ground, but found no trace of the missing girl. Lucian took a different approach, using his knowledge of child psychology and frontier survival to think like Marie rather than like a tactical manual. He focused on water sources, natural shelters, and paths that would appeal to someone small enough to see the landscape differently than adults. His search pattern looked random compared to Marcus's organized grid, but it was actually based on understanding how lost children typically behaved when separated from their families in wilderness conditions. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day when Lucien found signs that Marie had been following a game trail that led toward a series of caves where she might have taken shelter. The evidence was subtle: broken twigs at child height, small footprints in patches of soft earth, and disturbed vegetation that suggested someone had passed through recently. Marcus had searched the same area but missed the signs, because his military training focused on detecting adult threats rather than tracking frightened children. When Lucian finally found Marie huddled in a shallow cave, weak from hunger and exposure but alive, her first words revealed everything about the difference between him and his rival. "Are you here to help me?" she whispered, her trust in his kindness immediate and complete. Marcus would have rescued her with efficiency and professionalism, but Lucian rescued her with gentleness and understanding that made her feel safe rather than simply saved. As he carried her back toward civilization, speaking softly to keep her calm while sharing his water and food to restore her strength, Marie's obvious comfort with him provided the final proof Brigitte needed about which man possessed the character she wanted in a partner. Brigitte's decision was announced before the entire community with ceremony that honored both the importance of her choice and the respect she held for the man she was rejecting. Marcus had performed competently during the tests, demonstrating skills and resources that would have made him valuable to any community lucky enough to recruit him. But competence wasn't the same as character, and his efficiency in searching for Marie had been overshadowed by Lucien's compassion for a frightened child who needed comfort as much as rescue. "Marcus Delacroix," Brigitte said formally, her voice carrying the authority of absolute judgment. "You are a formidable man who would bring strength and resources to any partnership, but you seek to possess rather than cherish, to control rather than support. You would make me smaller to make yourself feel larger, and I will never again allow anyone to diminish what I've fought so hard to become." Her rejection was delivered with respect but also with finality that made it clear no appeal would be considered. Marcus's reaction revealed the true nature that had been hidden beneath his polished exterior, his mask of civilized behavior dropping to show the predator underneath. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything," he snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon with movements that suggested violence was never far from his thoughts. "This provincial fool will never be able to protect you when real danger comes. He'll get you killed through weakness, and your precious community will fall because you chose sentiment over strength." His threats were implicit but unmistakable, promising consequences for choosing incorrectly. The 50 women who surrounded them responded to Marcus's implied threats with the coordinated precision of soldiers defending their commander, their weapons appearing in their hands with speed that made his advantage in individual combat meaningless against organized opposition. Marcus found himself facing odds that even his considerable skills couldn't overcome, and his retreat was as graceful as someone in his position could manage. "This isn't over," he promised as he mounted his horse. "You'll regret this choice, and when you do, don't expect me to save you from the consequences of your stupidity." As Marcus rode away, his departure marked the end of a chapter in Brigitte's life that had haunted her for 5 years. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of something new and precious. A partnership based on mutual respect rather than domination, understanding rather than possession, and love that made both partners stronger rather than requiring one to diminish the other. When Brigitte turned to Lucien and smiled with joy that transformed her fierce features into something radiant and beautiful, he understood that he'd won more than a wife. He'd earned membership in a family that would challenge and support him for the rest of his life. The ceremony that bound Lucien to Brigitte and her community was unlike any wedding he'd ever witnessed, combining ancient traditions with innovations that reflected their unique culture. The 50 women formed a circle around the couple, each holding a weapon that represented their commitment to defending the union they were witnessing. Brigitte wore armor that had belonged to her grandmother, while Lucien was dressed in clothes handmade by the community's craftswomen as a symbol of his acceptance into their family. The vows they exchanged were partnerships contracts rather than traditional marriage promises, with each partner committing to support the other's growth rather than demanding submission or dominance. "I choose you not because you complete me," Brigitte declared, "but because you inspire me to complete myself. I promise to stand beside you in battle, to challenge you when you're wrong, and to trust you with my life and the lives of those I protect." Her words carried weight that went beyond personal affection to encompass political alliance between individuals whose partnership would affect entire communities. Lucien's response revealed how much he'd changed during his time with these extraordinary women, his voice carrying confidence that had been absent since Isabella's betrayal. I choose you because you've shown me that love isn't about possession, but about partnership. I promise to respect your strength, to support your leadership, and to prove myself worthy of the trust you're placing in me. His vows were simpler than hers, but equally binding, marking his transformation from bitter bachelor to man ready to build something meaningful with someone who matched his commitment to growth. The ritual that followed the vows involved each of the 50 women offering gifts that represented different aspects of the life Lucien was joining. Some gave weapons, others provided tools, and a few offered personal items that carried spiritual significance within their culture. Each gift came with advice, warnings, or blessings that revealed how thoroughly they'd accepted him as family member rather than outsider. By the time the ceremony ended, Lucien possessed everything needed to function as full member of their society. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with contests, storytelling, and demonstrations of skills that showcased the community's remarkable achievements. Lucien participated not as honored guest, but as family member expected to contribute his own talents to the festivities. When he shared stories of his early ranching failures and the lessons they'd taught him about persistence, the laughter and encouragement he received made it clear that his new family valued honesty about weakness as much as displays of strength. As the festival continued around them, Brigitte and Lucien found quiet moments together that allowed them to begin building the intimate connection that would sustain their partnership through whatever challenges lay ahead. The mountain stronghold that Brigitte's people called home was more sophisticated and extensive than anything Lucien had imagined possible in such remote territory. Hidden valleys contained fields of crops that had been modified through careful breeding to thrive in harsh conditions, while workshops produced tools, weapons, and crafts that rivaled anything available in major cities. The community was entirely self-sufficient, trading with the outside world only for luxuries and materials they couldn't produce themselves, making them independent of the economic systems that controlled most frontier settlements. The women who made up the community came from diverse backgrounds that told stories of survival, escape, and transformation that would have challenged the strongest men. Some were widows who'd refused to accept dependency after their husbands' deaths. Others were runaways from arranged marriages or abusive relationships, and a few were criminals who'd found redemption through service to something larger than themselves. What they shared was determination to create lives based on their own choices rather than society's expectations. The military organization that protected their isolation was more advanced than most territorial militias, with training programs that produced warriors capable of defeating professional soldiers through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Their weapons included innovations that improved on standard designs, while their communication systems allowed coordination across vast distances without detection by outside observers. They'd created a society that could defend itself against any threat the conventional world might present. The economic foundation of their community was based on enterprises that generated substantial wealth while remaining invisible to territorial tax collectors and business competitors. They controlled mineral rights to several productive mines, operated trading networks that connected remote settlements across multiple territories, and provided specialized services to clients who valued discretion above conventional legitimacy. Their prosperity was real and sustainable, making them wealthy enough to maintain independence indefinitely. The revelation that impressed Lucien most was their educational system, which produced women whose intellectual capabilities exceeded those of most university graduates. They'd created libraries, laboratories, and workshops that supported research into subjects ranging from engineering to medicine to agricultural science. The knowledge they'd accumulated was impressive in its scope and practical application, making their community a center of learning that could contribute to human advancement if they chose to share what they'd discovered. As Lucian explored his new home and met the remarkable women who'd built it, he understood that joining this family meant becoming part of something unique and precious that was worth defending against any threat. Marcus's return came at winter's peak, when snow blocked most mountain passes and the community felt secure in their seasonal isolation. He brought with him a small army of mercenaries whose equipment and discipline marked them as professionals rather than ordinary frontier gunmen. And their arrival transformed the peaceful valley into a potential battlefield where superior numbers faced superior position and motivation. The siege that followed would test everything the community had built over the past decade. The attack began with Marcus's demand for Brigitte's surrender in exchange for the safety of her people, delivered with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never encountered organized resistance to his desires. "You've had months to reconsider your foolish choice," his message declared. "I'm offering one final opportunity to end this peacefully. Marry me willingly, and your community can continue to exist under my protection. Refuse, and I'll take what I want by force, while your precious family suffers the consequences of your stubbornness." His ultimatum revealed depths of obsession that went beyond rational desire into pathological need to possess what had been denied to him. The community's response was swift and coordinated, with defensive positions manned by warriors who'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of threat. But Marcus had learned from his previous encounters with their capabilities, and his mercenaries were equipped with weapons and tactics designed to neutralize the advantages that had protected the settlement. The resulting conflict would require more than superior training. It would demand sacrifice from people fighting for everything they held dear. Lucian found himself thrust into a leadership role he'd never sought, but couldn't avoid, his knowledge of conventional military thinking making him valuable in planning responses to Marcus's professional assault. The trust Brigitte placed in his tactical judgment was both humbling and terrifying, because failure would mean the destruction of everything she'd worked to build and the death or enslavement of people who'd accepted him as family. The weight of that responsibility transformed him from reluctant participant to committed defender of a way of life worth dying to preserve. The first day of fighting revealed that Marcus's mercenaries were skilled and well-equipped, but they lacked the desperate motivation that drove defenders fighting for their homes and freedom. As night fell over a battlefield littered with the bodies of attackers who'd underestimated their opponents, both sides understood that the siege would be decided by endurance and will rather than superior numbers or better weapons. The community would either break under sustained pressure or prove that some things were too precious to surrender, regardless of the cost of defending them. The battle for the mountain community raged for 6 days, with Marcus's mercenaries launching coordinated attacks that tested every defense the women had prepared over the years. Their superior numbers allowed them to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, while their professional training made them dangerous opponents who learned from each failed assault. But the defenders fought with the fury of people protecting their homes, their families, and their right to exist as they chose, and that motivation proved more powerful than mere tactical advantage. Lucian distinguished himself during the fighting by leading counterattacks that broke enemy formations, attempting to penetrate their defenses, his leadership inspiring others to acts of courage that turned potential disasters into victories. The man who'd once hidden from life behind carefully maintained isolation now threw himself into battle with determination that impressed even the community's most experienced warriors. His transformation from reluctant husband to committed defender was complete, marking him as someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Brigitte fought like the legendary warrior she'd always been, her presence on the battlefield serving as inspiration for defenders who drew strength from her refusal to yield ground to enemies seeking to destroy their way of life. When she was wounded during a particularly vicious assault, the community's response was immediate and overwhelming, a counterattack so fierce that it drove the mercenaries back to their original positions while leaving dozens of their comrades dead in the snow. Their leader's injury had transformed defenders into avengers seeking blood payment for harm done to someone they loved. The turning point came when Lucian proposed a strategy that used the community's intimate knowledge of local terrain against enemies who'd been forced to fight on unfamiliar ground. His plan involved abandoning some defensive positions to draw the mercenaries into a trap where superior numbers became liability rather than advantage. The tactic was risky, requiring perfect timing and coordination, but it offered their only hope of victory against opponents who could afford to accept casualties they couldn't match. The final assault began at dawn on the 7th day, with both sides understanding that the outcome would determine whether the community survived as an independent society or was destroyed by forces that couldn't tolerate its existence. As Lucian and Brigitte stood together on the walls, they defended for nearly a week, their hands briefly touching in a gesture that conveyed love, determination, and mutual recognition that they were fighting for something precious enough to justify any sacrifice. The battle's conclusion would prove whether love and courage could triumph over greed and obsession when the stakes included everything they held dear. The trap Lucien had designed worked with devastating precision, drawing Marcus's overconfident mercenaries into a narrow valley where their numerical advantage became meaningless against defenders who controlled the high ground and knew every rock and tree that could provide cover or concealment. The mercenaries found themselves caught in a killing field where retreat was impossible and advance was suicide. Their professional training useless against enemies who fought with intimate knowledge of terrain that had been prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. Marcus's reaction to seeing his expensive army destroyed by frontier women was a mixture of rage and disbelief that pushed him beyond rational thought into pure fury. He launched a final desperate assault on the community's main defensive position, leading the survivors of his mercenary force in a charge that was more about wounded pride than tactical necessity. His obsession with possessing Brigitte had consumed his ability to think strategically, transforming him from dangerous opponent into desperate madman whose predictable actions made him vulnerable to countermeasures. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brutal and personal, with Marcus cutting through defenders like a force of nature driven by years of frustrated desire and accumulated hatred. His skill with weapons was formidable, his physical strength impressive, and his determination absolute, making him dangerous even when surrounded by enemies who outnumbered him 10-1. But his focus on reaching Brigitte made him careless about protecting himself from attacks by defenders who understood that stopping him was worth any personal sacrifice. Lucian's confrontation with Marcus was inevitable. Two men whose opposite approaches to love and leadership made peaceful coexistence impossible. The fight was everything Lucien had feared and more. Marcus was stronger, faster, and more skilled with weapons, advantages that nearly proved decisive during the first minutes of their duel. But Lucien fought with something Marcus couldn't understand, love that made him stronger rather than possessive, determination that came from protecting rather than conquering, and courage that was rooted in partnership rather than dominance. The decisive moment came when Marcus's obsession with defeating Lucien made him forget about the other defenders surrounding their fight. His focus on personal victory blinded him to the danger from Brigitte, who used his distraction to end the conflict with a single, well-placed shot that dropped him to the ground with a bullet through his heart. As Marcus died in the snow, his face showing more surprise than pain, the siege finally ended with defenders who'd proved that some things were indeed worth dying to protect. The community had survived its greatest test, but more importantly, it had proved that love based on respect and partnership was stronger than obsession based on possession and control. The aftermath of the siege revealed both the cost of victory and the strength of the community that had survived its greatest test. 12 defenders had died protecting their home, their sacrifice honored with ceremonies that celebrated their courage while mourning their loss. The wounded numbered in the dozens, requiring medical attention that stretched their resources while demonstrating the depth of their commitment to caring for each other, regardless of the personal cost involved. The destruction of Marcus's mercenary force sent shockwaves throughout the territory, with stories of frontier women defeating professional soldiers spreading like wildfire among settlements that had never imagined such a thing was possible. The community found itself famous in ways that threatened their carefully maintained secrecy, forcing them to consider whether their victory had made continued isolation impossible. Fame brought both opportunities and dangers that would require careful navigation to avoid destroying what they'd fought so hard to preserve. Lucian's role in the victory earned him respect throughout the territory as the man who'd helped defend one of the most remarkable communities in the American West. His transformation from bitter bachelor to heroic defender became the stuff of legend, but more importantly, it marked his complete acceptance as member of a family that had tested him in every possible way. The man who'd once hidden from life behind walls of isolation had become someone who fought to protect what he loved, and the change was permanent and profound. Brigitte's recovery from her wounds was slow and sometimes painful, but it provided opportunities for Lucien to demonstrate the kind of devoted care that proved his love went beyond admiration, for her strength to encompass tenderness, for her vulnerability. His attention during her healing revealed depths of compassion that complemented the courage he'd shown during the fighting, making their partnership more complete and balanced than either had thought possible. The decision to gradually open their community to carefully selected outsiders marked a new chapter in their development, with Lucien serving as liaison between their hidden society and the conventional world that was slowly learning to respect their achievements. His reputation as honest man who'd earned his place among extraordinary women made him perfect ambassador for people who wanted to share some of their innovations without compromising their essential independence. The siege had ended with more than mere survival. It had proved that their way of life was strong enough to defend itself, while generous enough to help others who shared their values. 5 years after the siege, Lucien and Brigitte stood together on the porch of their home, watching their twin children play in the yard where the final battle had been fought. The boy had inherited his mother's fierce independence, while the girl showed signs of her father's gentleness, both of them embodying the best qualities of parents who'd found love by choosing courage over comfort. Their family was proof that different strengths could complement each other to create something stronger and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. The community had grown and prospered in ways that honored both their traditions and their willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. New members were carefully selected from people who shared their values rather than their backgrounds, creating diversity that strengthened rather than diluted their essential character. The innovations they'd developed were gradually being shared with other settlements, spreading knowledge that improved life throughout the territory while maintaining their competitive advantages. Lucien's transformation from reluctant bachelor to devoted husband and father was complete. But more importantly, he'd become a leader whose judgment was trusted by people who'd learned to value character over conventional credentials. His partnership with Brigitte had evolved into something that transcended romance to encompass shared responsibility for protecting and nurturing a way of life that offered hope to anyone seeking alternatives to conventional society's limitations and failures. The school they'd established attracted students from across the territory, young people eager to learn from teachers who combined practical skills with academic knowledge in ways that prepared graduates for success in any environment they chose. The education their children received was broader and deeper than anything available in conventional schools, creating the next generation of leaders who would carry their values forward into an uncertain future. As sunset painted the mountains gold and red around their hidden valley, Lucien reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolation to integration, from fear to love, from self-protection to family protection. The cowboy who'd once refused to consider marriage had found happiness with a woman whose strength made his own weaknesses irrelevant, whose love made his own courage possible, and whose vision had created a community where both could flourish. Their love story had become legend throughout the territory, but more importantly, it had become foundation for lives that proved love was indeed the most powerful force in human experience when it was based on respect, partnership, and shared commitment to something larger than individual happiness. The bachelor who'd feared giants had learned to love one, and in doing so, had discovered that giants could be gentle when their strength was tempered by wisdom and their power was guided by love.